2025 에이펙 국제경주역사문화포럼은 연결, 혁신, 번영이라는 주제로 세계 지성들과 함께 이 시간을 채우고 있습니다. 지구상에는 수많은 생명체들이 공존하고 있습니다. 수만 년 전 생각해보면 인간은 굉장히 무기력한 존재였어요. 덩치 큰 동물들에 의해서 위협을 받는, 그리고 항상 위험에 처해져 있는 그런 나약한 존재에 불과했습니다. 그런데 오늘날 우리를 살펴보면 최상위 종이 됐다고 말할 수가 있겠죠. 자, 이토록 찬란한 문명을 우리 인류는 어떻게 꽃피울 수 있었을까요? 하버드 대학교 인간진화생물학 교수이자 인류학자인 조지프 헨릭 교수님과 함께 오늘 강연을 통해서 그 소중한 비밀을 파헤쳐 보도록 하겠습니다.
Highways, ports, postal services, and telegraphs. But to achieve many of the fancy technological and other kinds of creative products that humanity has produced. There's a massive increase in IQs all around the world, and the IQ is still going up. Our brains seem to be getting smaller. What's going on? Okay, so what does this mean? What does this idea of creativity mean if I don't think the cognitive abilities of the 21st century are going to be the same ones that were preferred in the 20th century? But there's another kind of brain called the collective brain, and this is what explains how we figured out how to survive in all these environments. What's the secret of our species' success?
자, 조지프 헨릭 교수님을 뜨거운 박수로 맞이해 주시기 바랍니다.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. So today, I wanted to explore a little bit about what it means to be human and where we came from an evolutionary perspective. And to do that, I like to begin by asking the question, what's the secret of our species' success? And now when most people think about this question of what is the secret of our species' success, they think about some of our technological achievements. So for example, the construction of cities or monumental architecture like the pyramids, or industrial technology such as the train pictured here, agriculture, flight, and most recently, tinkering with the basic structure of DNA. But I want to take you back before the age of industrial technology, before the first cities or the origins of writing, into the Paleolithic, before the origins of agriculture, to 100,000 years ago, when our ancestors first began to expand around the world. During this expansion, we came to inhabit an immense diversity of environments, from the Arctic tundra to the arid deserts of Australia to the neotropical forests of South America. And in doing this, we didn't do it the way most other species had done it, kind of the old-fashioned way. We didn't develop local genetic adaptations that allowed us to deal with this diversity of environments. So for example, our competitor species in terms of the amount of biomass controlled in the invertebrate world is actually the ants. So ants have spread all over the world. There are ants in the Arctic, and there are ants in the deserts, and there are ants in the forests. But ants have accomplished this by speciating into over 14,000 different species. Meanwhile, we humans have relatively little genetic variation, so not very much genetication. So how did we adapt to this immense diversity of environments? We have big brains, and these big brains are capable of individually solving problems, individual creativity, and this is what explains how we figured out how to survive in all these environments. I'm going to try to make the case that in fact our big brains aren't nearly as impressive as you think they are. But there's another kind of brain called the collective brain, which is really where the action is for much of human creativity and for what has allowed us to not only survive in all these different environments, but to achieve many of the fancy technological and other kinds of creative products that humanity has produced. Okay, now here's the thing about human brains is that our species hasn't actually changed the size of our brains, at least not increased it, for between 200 and 300,000 years. So no change in our size. In fact, more recently, the growing number of cranial specimens we have from Homo sapiens is suggesting that something quite different may have happened. It appears that there may have actually been a decline in human brain size sometime after 50,000 years. I got a little green dot on there. So this is about Neanderthal brain size, and it begins declining over this 30,000 year period. This is 30,000 years, that's now. And then at the same time, based on data from the historian Anne Morris, we have this exponential increase in social development. So this social development index, which Professor Morris has assembled, includes all kinds of things, including the agricultural capacity of the society, as well as writing and various kinds of technologies that appear in the ancient world. So you see a dramatic increase in the social development index. At the same time, our brains seem to be getting smaller. What's going on? Now, one reaction to this could be that, well, maybe cranial size isn't really the important thing for our computational and cognitive capacities, for our intelligence. Okay, now what we have here, what I'm going to be arguing is that we have a case of shrinking brains, but the way we can explain the increase in social development is an expansion of our collective brains. We became increasingly good at putting our heads together, at building large networks of social interconnections. Now, at some point, there's a kind of credulity reaction, which is to say, look, we've talked about our global dominance, our ecological spread, the construction of monumental architecture, so there had to have been some individual, some genius, who was figuring out how to do agriculture, creating fertilizer, developing weed killers, figuring out how to domesticate animals, coming up with the idea of milking our animals, inventing antibiotics, coming up with burials to protect us from decaying bodies, quarantines, things associated with public health, and all kinds of other fancy things. The problem with that argument is this list is actually not for humans, but it's a list for what ants have accomplished. Over the last 50 million years, natural selection has selected ants to be able to do all these things. And nobody seems to think that ants need creative geniuses or that this depends on individual ant brains figuring it out. It's an evolutionary process. And what I'm going to suggest over the next hour or so is that we have a cultural evolutionary process that can do things outside of our conscious awareness without individual minds achieving them in a way similar to what ants can do. Now, you might think, at least as a first pass from an evolutionary perspective, that we would be fantastic at surviving as hunter-gatherers. Our brains evolved for 2 million years to be able to find food, build fires, travel across the landscape, navigate across the landscape. So we should be really good at this, at least if you have a sort of standard picture of how all this stuff works. Now, I'm just going to have time to give you one case of lost European explorers. And so the case for today is the Burke and Wills expedition. So the year is 1860, and a former penal colony, a British penal colony called Melbourne, the worthies in Melbourne decide to put together a public-private partnership in order to conduct an exploration across the middle of the continent to the Gulf of Carpentaria and then back, mapping and also plotting a route for a possible telegraph. And they break up into two parties. One is a group of 4 men who is going to go to Cooper's Creek, which is in the middle here, right there. And then the resupply party is going to meet them as they're coming back, and everyone is going to return to Melbourne. So 4 men led by Robert Burke take off from Cooper's Creek with 12 weeks of food. The adventure, the trip, is taking them longer than they expected, and they begin to run out of food. So they begin traveling back. There's an unfortunate incident with one of the men probably trying to steal food, and he ends up dead. He was probably shot by Burke. Some of their camels escape. They have to eat their pack animals. Now, soon into this trip, their last camel gets stuck in the mud and dies. So the party ends up stuck along Cooper's Creek because they don't know how to find water in the Australian desert. And without the camel, they can't carry enough water to make the journey. So they begin trying to live off the land. They can't make tools, they can't hunt kangaroos, they're not catching fish, but they do manage to engage with some of the locals, the Yawantru tribe. And they get some gifts of fish, And while in one of the camps, they notice some of the women processing a sporocarp called nardu. So they search around, and out in the bush, they find some nardo, and they collect it, and they make a porridge. The problem is that when they watched the women, they didn't pay enough attention to what the women were doing. Because in Australian camps, nardu has to be processed. It has to be grinded, leached, heated, and eaten with a mussel shell spoon, or it can be ground, leached, and baked in ash. And this is important because otherwise nardu is poisonous. It contains an enzyme that will cause a horrible disease called beriberi. So these guys essentially poisoned themselves while they were eating a lot on a full stomach. One member of the crew did stumble delirious into the outback and was rescued by the Awantru tribe and eventually picked up by a rescue party from Melbourne. So that's how we know the story. So here we have some big brain primates, some humans, who are forced to live as hunter-gatherers in a place that humans have lived successfully and thrived for 60,000 years. But they can't do the basic things a hunter-gatherer needs to do. They can't figure out how to do it. Almost everything they needed to know, any Aboriginal adolescent would have known how to do it, including how to find water in the desert, which would have allowed them to get to the police post. But they just couldn't survive without this large body of knowledge. So what these cases of lost European explorers tell us is that somehow as hunter-gatherers, we've become dependent on a vast body of cultural knowledge that tells us how to find food, how to make tools, how to detoxify the many plants and animals in our environments. Okay, now coming at this another angle, if we actually compare our cognitive abilities to our fellow apes, how do things look? So this is research done by Mike Tomasello and Esther Herman at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology. And what these researchers did is they took human 2.5-year-old children and they had a competition against chimpanzees and orangutans, two of our closely related ape relatives among the great apes. And what you can see from my plot here, which comes from their scientific paper in the journal Science, is that the human children don't do appreciably better than the chimpanzees and only a little bit better than the orangutans. So at least on basic problem solving, which includes tool use and quantities, it's not like the children are really blowing the roof off. You would expect the world's most global dominant species to maybe do a little bit better. Okay, now I want to anticipate where I'm eventually going to go, which is that one of the things that makes us smart and makes us able to solve problems is that we get a cultural download of a bunch of pre-built solutions. So some simple examples would be things like springs, screws, and levers. These were culturally evolved at some point in human history. Once they exist, they tend to persist and spread. And then when you grow up in a world with springs or screws or pulleys, then you can learn how they work, and you can redeploy them to solve new problems. But these are hard to invent the first time, but then easy to redeploy once you can see how they work. Okay, so the case that I'm making is that to really understand the origins of creativity, we don't want to focus too much on the individual problem-solving ability of our brains, but we want to think of constellations and interconnections among brains. This occurs and is particularly important in humans because we're a cultural species. More than any other species, we come into the world and we learn from others, and we learn from many different people and recombine ideas. And once you're learning from others, these collective brains naturally emerge. Larger and more interconnected and more cognitively diverse collective brains are going to be more creative. They're going to make the individuals within them more creative. So we can think about natural selection shaping cognition, and then that gives rise to culture. And this can then do a feedback. Now, one of the things we find in young children is that first they tend to learn from the people around them, so members of their family, older siblings, parents, but then by adolescence, they're looking to a wider world, and they're beginning to update from older peers, older adolescents, and young adults. So this is this changeover you see over human life history. And this can give rise to adaptive networks. So this is the beginning of how collective brains come about. Now, some would say, well, maybe that makes sense for the average person, but what about the creatives, right? The geniuses who are going to just think these amazing thoughts that no one has thought before. In fact, what we see when we study creatives is that most ideas are recombinations. And what creatives are doing is they're just taking ideas that are further apart. they're accessing a wider range of ideas to make their recombination. So they're doing social learning, they're just stretching a bit further to find who they're going to learn from, to recombine distant ideas. Okay, now over the course of human evolution, this selective forms of learning where we copy the more prestigious and the more successful members and we recombine ideas, we do this automatically and unconsciously. People don't even know they're doing it. And what this can produce is cultural adaptations without anybody in the community even knowing they emerged. If this is true, then the following follows. So larger populations will be better at doing this. Populations with more cognitive diversity will be better at doing this, and populations with greater social interconnectedness will be better at doing this. And these are, I think of them as multiplying each other, but they're interacting. So if you have a big population, but everybody is a cognitive clone, you don't produce any recombinations because everybody has the exact same stuff in their heads. So, yeah. And in fact, I'm going to make the case that our collective brains are fractal, and that this concept of size, social interconnectedness, and cognitive diversity apply at all levels. And so here I want you to think about you in terms of a creative individual. So what is your capacity to create? Now, the first thing we're going to look at is teams. And then we're going to say, well, teams exist within neighborhoods. And in neighborhoods, you can meet different kinds of people, potentially. Some neighborhoods are better than others. Cities are going to vary in size and cognitive diversity and density, so that's going to play a role. Cities are going to be nearer and further from other cities, and those other cities are going to be more and less large, so that's going to matter. And these are going to be in countries, which are going to have borders and access, lack of access. And then finally, continents are going to matter. So we're going to take a tour through these different levels. So starting with teams, and there's a large literature on teams, and the basic findings are that teams are particularly creative when there's open and free-flowing communication. People should feel like equals and they should be able to criticize each other and share ideas. There should be some competitiveness at the team level. So you don't want to compete with your other team members, you want to be competing against other teams. That's kind of the basic thing. Efforts to explore this in more detail come from recent use of big data. So this is scientific citation data trying to measure something like cognitive diversity, and these guys measured in lots of different ways. So this is an international team of scientists who took a database of scientific papers written by 1.5 million scientists from 24 different subfields from 1958 to 2009. So it's a big swash of scientific papers. And the measure we're going to use is scientific impact. So scientific papers can be measured in terms of how much impact they have on futures. Do other people pay attention to them in the future? Are they cited in the future? And they measure diversity on these teams in many different ways. So one is age diversity. And you can see that the more age-diverse teams were, the more scientific impact they had. Well, that kind of makes sense because junior scientists are trained in new techniques, they're new into the field, they're fresh in training, and they're teamed with older scientists who have more wisdom and experience and have done these things multiple times. So that seems to bring together some potentially powerful advantages. Different disciplines are more impactful. So if you get chemists and biologists and physicists together, they tend to produce scientific papers that are more impactful. But one of the most striking ones is ethnic diversity. So using the last names on scientific papers, they looked at nationalities, which is not as fine-grained as I'd like, but that's what these guys did. They used nationalities as a measure of ethnic diversity. And this was by far the biggest factor. So it's stronger than the other two. And so more ethnic diversity on your scientific team leads to greater scientific impact. Now, in presenting this, I know that people often wonder, well, how does ethnic diversity translate into cognitive diversity? These people are trained in the same scientific fields, right? They have PhDs in the same thing. How could that happen? Well, just to illustrate one way it could happen, let me introduce you to the winners of the 2023 Nobel Prize in Medicine. So this is Katie Carrico and Drew Weissman. They were based at the University of Pennsylvania, and in the early 2000s, they came up with a scientific finding that was crucial to producing the mRNA vaccines that helped many of us through the COVID period. And they were facing a challenge, an uphill battle, that they were trying to figure out how they might use mRNA to get inside of cells to command the cell's machinery to make the relevant anti-proteins, antigens that would allow to destroy the virus. And this had been a problem because when you introduce the foreign mRNA into the cell's defenses kick up and destroy the incoming mRNA. So this was their research project. They actually met at a copy machine at the University of Pennsylvania and got to talking. So they met there, a serendipitous meeting. And it is relevant, so they were both in the US. Drew was from Massachusetts, but Katie Carrico was trained and was a scientist in Hungary before moving to the University of Pennsylvania. And she was a scientist in Hungary during a period when the Soviet Union existed. And if you lived in Hungary, you couldn't just call up scientific suppliers and order up some mRNA. And you couldn't take advantage of many of the things that American scientists routinely do to get their supplies. So she had to learn how to make her own mRNA. And this gave her an advantage, and it helped her to do things that other American scientists couldn't have done. Even though her and Drew both had PhDs in biochemistry, she had a special set of skills because of the particular environment that she came from, and it allowed her to make a unique contribution here, which eventually resulted in the Nobel Prize for her. It's worth knowing that when they sent their Nobel Prize-winning results to the journal Nature, which is the most important journal in the world for science, it was promptly desk rejected, which means they wouldn't even look at it. They said it was incremental science. Turned out it wasn't incremental science, but okay. Now, we see other kinds of diversity on teams too. So along the horizontal here, you see the team size is varying. And then on the left side, you see the novelty of the paper. So this is, again, analyzing scientific papers. And on the other side, it's the impact. So you can see that as team size increases, you get more novelty in your papers and you get higher scientific impact. Now, there's two lines there. There's a line for mixed gender teams, and there's a line for same gender teams. And what you see is that over and above the effective team size, having a mixed gender team actually makes you more novel and more scientifically impactful in the future. And scientists try to figure out, well, what is the gender doing? Is it a different field? And it's very difficult to figure it out. It's almost like when you put people of different genders together, they each bring something different. There's some flow of information among minds that doesn't happen otherwise, perhaps. All right. Now, I should note that this team size doesn't go up infinitely, because what happens is as you grow the team bigger, eventually you reduce your social interconnectedness. So bigger teams are only better if you're still socially interconnected. And after about 10, science teams don't operate it very well after about size 10. When you get up to 15 and 20, you need a hierarchy and a structure, and everything changes. Okay, so that's the team, the neighborhood, and we're going to go up from there. So using patent data, researchers have compared different neighborhoods in US cities to figure out which neighborhood gets the most bang for the creative buck. Here, looking at scientific patents. And there tend to be office parks on the outskirts of metropolis that produce the most number of patents. But these patents are mostly incremental patents. But if you look for the high-impact atypical patents, you find that the most urban, the densest areas of cities produce the highest impact patents, the most novel patents. And this is just because if you're in a denser part of the city, you're more likely to encounter people you wouldn't otherwise encounter. You're basically tripping on each other at the coffee shops and the bars and the restaurants and the workout facilities and the parking garages and all those kinds of places, which seems to be what's behind a lot of the stories of great invention in these places. So neighborhood matters. All right, other things matter too. And so one place that people could meet would be at pubs or saloons. So one of my favorite papers in this genre of work on innovation comes from the economist Mike Andrews. And Mike went back into the US patent database and studied the effect of saloons. So saloons around 1900 in the US were really interesting places because they were often social hubs. New work opportunities would be posted on bulletin boards. People would get their mail delivered there. If there was one phone in the town, it was in the saloon. And both rich and poor alike were going to saloons, although we'll talk about some people who didn't go to saloons in a few minutes. Now, as you may or may not know, in around 1920, the US had a federal ban, a nationwide ban on saloons and on selling alcohol, producing alcohol. But what Mike did is he said, well, that doesn't help me very much because I can't see what causes what. So Mike took advantage of the fact that different states in the US began to ban alcohol starting in 1910. And then, in 1911, another state, in 1914, another state. So we can see whether the patenting pattern changes as different states put the bans on. Now, I really like this experiment because if you think it's individual cognition, you might think that banning alcohol is a good thing, right? So people are drinking less and maybe their brains are functioning better so they can do more invention. Or if you think that social interconnectedness and swapping ideas over a pint is a good thing, and that's important, then you might think that the saloons might drive down innovation. You can see the zero up here. And this is the years before the ban, and this is the years after the ban. So the counties in different states are considered dry counties if they don't have saloons, and wet counties if they have saloons. What you see is before the ban, the wet counties are producing more patents per capita. So it's as if people in wet counties with the saloons are more creative than people in the dry counties. But after the ban, all the saloons close, and the wet counties are actually less creative than the dry counties, so they drop below. And here the idea is that people can't meet in the pub, swap ideas, and make baby ideas. Okay. Now, in order to test this idea, because different things could be going on, Mike decided to look and compare different ethnic groups in the patent database. Now, during this era, the most common saloon goers were people of Irish descent and German descent. So he finds that you basically get a massive drop in patenting among men of Irish and German descent. Women couldn't go to saloons unless they were working, and so you don't see any change in the women inventors who are present in the U.S. patent database, just at low frequency. And then Jews and Greeks also didn't participate in pub culture, and their rate of innovation doesn't change so it fits with the idea that something was happening in the pub among the Irish and Germans. And there's interesting variation among these states. So Mike's able to show that some states, even though you couldn't sell alcohol, you could still make it, so alcohol consumption didn't go down, and he's able to show it wasn't the alcohol, it was actually the social meeting place. Okay, cities. Now this is a completely dominant effect that I found everywhere I looked. I'm showing you data from 1975 in the US, but it seems to be the case across the board that larger populations produce more patents per capita. It's as if people get smarter when they go into a larger city. They're just more productive in terms of patents. Now, economists and others would worry maybe the smarter people are going to the bigger cities or something, but there's now a lot of ways to address that, and there seems to be a real straight size effect. Holds back into history. It's actually stronger as you go back into history. It's become somewhat less important more recently. So my colleagues and I wanted to study this in depth, and we wanted to see if we could get at the diversity part of the question. We also measure the population size, so that allows us to look at this. And what we find is that larger and more culturally diverse counties produce more patents and more breakthrough patents per capita. Okay, so railroads interconnect cities. If the collective brain is true, then connecting two cities by a powerful method of transportation, which allows people and ideas to flow, ought to make people more creative. So there's great studies from Sweden and also from Germany. As railroad track was laid in each of these cities, we can look at what happens to the production of knowledge and creativity in each place. So this is a study of book production. So let's get away from patents. Let's look at the production of a broad range of books. You can look at books about history. You can look at books about law. You can look at novels. Doesn't matter what you look at. It tells you the same story. And this is 19th century Germany. So the zero is when the railroad connects. So you should think of the city or town as suddenly getting access to the rest of the city or town because they're on the railroad network and they're connected to the rest of the German-speaking world. And before that, not much is happening, but as soon as you connect, you begin to see an uptick over the next couple of decades in the number of titles produced and the production of new topics. Now, I could show you tons more data on this because it holds for direct flight. So if two cities previously weren't connected by a direct flight and you make one, suddenly there's more collaborations between the city and you get more co-authored books and you get more joint patents and whatnot. Overall increase in the production of patents. It works for canals, highways, ports, postal services, and telegraphs. All of these things increase the rate of creativity. Okay, psychological traits. Now, psychological traits are important here, not because they might make us more individually creative, but because they affect the functioning of the collective brain. So actually, I have a whole line of work studying global differences in how people think about the world and think in different places. So here I put a couple of examples. So this is trust, the trust you feel in people of the out group, so people you don't know, strangers, versus your family and friends. And so everybody trusts their family and friends more than they trust the out groups, but the difference between that has an important effect on all kinds of things, including whether people are willing to swap ideas and collaborate on new projects. And individualism. So this is a measure of the degree to which you see other people as according to their relationships, so who are their family and friends, as opposed to what are their individual traits that might be interesting to you. Are they honest? Are they trustworthy? Things like that. All right, so these vary around the world in lots of ways, and they can affect people's willingness to cooperate and exchange ideas. Okay, but for our study, my colleagues and I got the patent data, patents again, from Europe. And we're able to get very fine-grained data. So we have GPS coordinates for each patent. And for each small region of Europe, we have data on the psychology of the people there. So we have a measure of individualism, their trust in strangers, their fairness towards strangers, and their nonconformity. So how willing are they to go against what they think other people want them to do or say. And what we're going to do is we're going to see if psychology predicts patenting. What we're going to do, though, too, is we're just going to look at places within each country. So we're not going to compare Germans and French. We're going to just compare Germans with other Germans by looking at the psychology of different German provinces, and the same thing in France, and then we do that for everywhere. And that's what you're going to see here. Okay. So across the board, places that are more individualistic produce more patents per capita, so it's as if people are more creative, each person is. More nonconformist, more patents, more impersonal fairness, more patents, and more impersonal trust, more patents. Just to make clear about the latter two, the trust and fairness, the idea is that if you have more trust in others and you think they're more fair-minded, you're willing to get together and start swapping ideas. You'll tell them your best idea. If you don't trust them, you would never tell them your best idea because they might take it and make it their best idea. So you have to have trust. Languages actually are more complex in larger and more interconnected populations. So you can look at number of words, you can look at the number of grammatical tools available, number of tenses, and you can also look at the number of phonemes. And larger populations are higher on all those counts. So you have more concepts to work with. There's more color terms, other kinds of categories. Okay, so that's the simple way. Now I want to get to IQ. Most people still think of IQ as some kind of very basic test of how the hardware works, how the machinery works in our head, how good are our brains, the physical brain at pattern recognition, for example. But here's an interesting fact. Over the 19th century, IQs went up dramatically, and you can see this around the world. The earliest data comes from the US. It goes back to at least 1900. There's a massive increase in IQs all around the world, a full standard deviation in many cases. Lots of populations, the IQ is still going up. And you can see when they started modernizing, and you can see the beginning of the uptick. So how does this work? So part of this enterprise says that our minds, cultural evolution should be shaping our minds to best navigate the world we're encountering. So to get at this, we did what might seem like an odd thing. We went to Namibia. So in northern Namibia and southern Angola, we have populations of people who are pastoralists, who are herding cows. And some populations, for random reasons, have schools, and some don't. So what we can do is study child development and the development of child cognition in places with schools and compare them to places without schools. There are probably lots of factors leading to this rise in IQ in lots of different countries around the world over the last 100 years. But certainly one is the spread of schools and the nature of schooling and the creation of what we call schooled environments. So not only do the kids go to school, but at some point they have schooled parents and schooled grandparents, and they live in a community that has people who went to school. And this changes the nature of all kinds of things about social interaction. And what we found is that in places with schools, you see the normal increase in cognitive abilities that has been documented in the US and lots of other places that you would expect. But in the places without schools, you see very little. You see very little change in cognitive ability. So what developmental psychologists thought was the normal maturational change in human cognition is actually the product of a schooled world. And you can still see it in northern Namibia. But I think more importantly, and more to our hypothesis, we also measured other aspects of cognition. So one thing we measured was dead reckoning. And so that is this ability. So if I said point to Seoul, I have no idea where it is actually. Maybe some of you do. But most people will, and I could pick another city and we could go through a list of cities, but it's a way of testing people to see if they know wherever they are, if they have a kind of compass going in their head. And people in lots of small-scale societies who didn't go to school get this answer correct. They know exactly where everything is. They're in the middle of the forest, they can get it correct. So we've done this test with populations all around the world. But if kids go to school, they get a lot worse at this. So their dead reckoning ability declines. This is a valuable cognitive ability if you're a pastoralist or a hunter-gatherer. When we learn to read, our facial recognition gets a little worse. And there's actually good neuroscience on this, showing how the part of your brain you use to be able to read quickly, read silently, and recognize letters, no matter what language they're in, crowds out some of our facial recognition machinery. So we get a little bit worse at recognizing faces. And finally, populations that didn't go to school were really good at learning how to use objects to solve problems. Whereas the schooled students seemed more constrained by, a can opener is for opening cans. You can't use it to clean the dirt out of a cow's foot or something. So they're harder at seeing new uses for commonly used objects. So in that way, they're less good at solving problems than the unschooled kids. So there's this interesting trade-off between cognitive abilities where what we see schools generating is a particular set of cognitive abilities. And I should say one interesting thing from this line of research is that I don't think the cognitive abilities of the 21st century are going to be the same ones that were preferred in the 20th century. All right. Okay. Now, thinking about whether there's something special about human brain. So I've been making the case that a lot of the action for human creativity is in the collective brain, in these larger networks. But you can ask the question, okay, so humans have had collective brains for a long time. We have all this culture. Can we say anything about how our cognition works? So the basic story that I've laid out in the past is that collective brains emerge. These generate all kinds of adaptive information about tools, plants and animals, shelters, medicines, rituals, and languages. And then this is a body of knowledge that everyone has to acquire. So our brains respond, so genetic evolution shapes our brains to make them larger and better at acquiring, storing, and organizing all of this information. So the way to think about why we have big brains is our big brains are for acquiring this vast body of knowledge that's stored out there in the minds of other members of our social group. And just to give you a sense of this, if you're living in the Ituri forest, so Central African rainforests, the foragers there know tons of information about different kinds of snakes. So you have to know which snakes spit, which snakes are poisonous, which aren't, which are good eating, and which you can use to make arrow poison, among many other things. So you have to have a pretty complex set of categories for snakes. So you keep going up. Children encounter this, and they grow up and they learn all this information. So they have this vast body of information about snakes that includes abstract categories of different kinds. And so, but a monkey only ever encounters snakes that basically can very quickly learn to stay away from them, and it doesn't have this large body of knowledge about the details on snake behavior and all the different things snakes can be used. So the idea is here that this abstraction became useful as this body of information provided a larger and larger data set. So finally it paid off for selection to do its thing. Okay, so what does this mean? What does this idea of creativity mean if we look and we think about human flourishing? So it's one thing to come up with novel inventions and more creative ideas, but what if you're just depressed all the time? So we want to think about the flourishing side of things. And I've told you that the secret to our species' success, the answer to my question, has to do with our cultural nature. So we acquire ideas from other people, we readily learn, we do this from infancy on, and we're social. We build social relationships in part to get all of that information. So we live in social groups and learn from each other. Okay, so can this tell us anything about what's going on with the epidemic of loneliness, depression, and anxiety that an increasing number of people seem to be feeling in the world? Well, the place I think we want to start is by thinking about the world in which we evolved. So this was a world in which we became more dependent on our communities than we would find in other species because we have to learn from them. Remember, Burke and Wills couldn't do anything. So even to get the basics of how to find food and water, we need to rely on learning from our communities. So we have these extended childhoods in which we sample and acquiring information from a community. Crucially, there's every reason to think that there's a number of social norms that evolved culturally that probably go well back into the Paleolithic. So all hunter-gatherers, for example, that have been studied by anthropologists engage in widespread food sharing, especially of valuable food sources. So you go out and go hunting, most guys come back empty-handed, but as long as one guy gets a kill, then everybody gets meat that night. And so you can do things that other animals can't do in terms of, because of this food sharing ability. Almost all groups have mutual aid norms. So if you get injured or old or you can't work for some reason, it's everyone's responsibility to care for you. Communal defense, everybody is responsible for keeping lookout, for watching. There's all kinds of norms and responsibilities of that. And people are obligated, and it's just expected you'll share information with other members of your community. You might not share with people from other communities, but you definitely share with people in your own community. There's storytelling and campfires where this information is shared. So what these set of norms, which probably accumulated over human evolutionary history, means is that my health and welfare depends on your health and welfare. Our fitnesses are intertwined. If you get sicker, that's bad for me. I'm going to get less meat because you can't go out hunting, and my kids are going to have less meat too. So it intertwines our fitnesses in a way that is just much less pronounced or non-existent in some other species. I conduct field work in the South Pacific where I study these marine agriculturalists in these Fijian villages. And people just cooperate in myriad ways. They work together to build each other's houses. They engage in collective planting. They share foods of all kinds. Households collaborate to bring back firewood. They share knowledge about how to open up turtles, and just many other domains. So we can't underestimate how interdependent people in many traditional human communities are. So the first thing we should expect is that people should kind of have a, how am I doing? And we should be asking ourselves, am I feeling ensconced in an interdependent network where, that I can depend on if I'm injured or hurt or something? And in the modern world, of course, we have unemployment insurance and health insurance, and it's not clear that you need other people in the modern world, but that doesn't mean our psychology has registered that. The other piece of this to remember is individuals should want to be seen as a valued member of the community. So I should be thinking, do others depend on me? Do others think of me as a valued member of a community, within a social group? And one wonders what happens to people's psychology if other people don't seem to matter, and I don't need anyone and no one needs me. That's certainly not the world in which we evolved in, and our minds probably aren't calibrated to navigate those worlds very well. And now I want to extend this into childhood. So from looking at the anthropological studies of hunter-gatherer groups, we can say a bunch of things about childhood. So the first thing we can say is that children evolved to grow up in mixed-age playgroups. So these mixed-age playgroups will play together. As I'll mention in a second, they often rehearse and pretend to do adult things, but they also teach, and there's also learning that goes on as the older children teach the younger children. the kids learn what's valued in their societies implicitly. So there's not a lot of instruction about we are the so-and-so who like so-and-so. Instead, they watch and they see which things are valued and what's important and how to be a good son and what it means to be a good friend and what skills in the village or the community are valued. It's also often underappreciated, but that children probably learn how to build bonds with others through observation, imitation, by watching what older kids do. What happens if you're not exposed to older kids? And this focuses on valued relations, locally valued skills, and locally valued talents. One thing that's often missed is the skills that we used over our evolutionary history were embodied. And what I mean is hunting, tracking, cooking, fishing, all of the things that Burke and Wills couldn't do are cognitive. You need to know a bunch of stuff and you need to develop some skills, but they're also physical. There's movement involved. There's touch, there's motivational systems. So there's this combined package. So much of our world involves separating cognitive from the physical. Okay. And then finally, they grew up in groups where at night the adults got together. People sat around the campfire, told stories, sung songs, engaged in ritual, built a sense of community. Children weren't put to bed, they just fell asleep eventually. So we intuitively learn what's valued in our societies, and as part of that we get these skills. And from a young age, especially what I see in Fiji, is kids learn how to do simple things that adults care about. So things like gathering firewood, fishing, cooking, they want to do that as soon as they can. These are things they see adults doing, and when the kids do it, this impresses the adults, and this is so they want to get that admiration. They're immediately making contributions to the household. Where I'm from, we've basically eliminated all child contributions to the household. And we've also eliminated another important aspect, which is older children caring for younger children. So what you see in all these communities is, the 9-year-olds take care of the 6-year-olds, and the 11-year-olds take care of the 8-year-olds. And there's this system where which the older kids take care of the younger kids and teach them. And adults don't have to do very little. They have to intervene every once in a while. But caring for the younger child could be an important piece of development. And it could give you a sense of connection that you wouldn't otherwise have. So in thinking about learning, you're learning skills, but also I'll mention learning about social bonds and relationships. It's pretty obvious that in these environments, there's all kinds of tactile elements to it. So hugs, bows, kisses, handholds, sense, warmth, and voice, which of course, if you're building friendships on your phone or online and stuff, you lose all of that tactility. But then there's also this, even for cognitive skills, we seem to have lost the physicality of them. If you just take a simple experiment and you randomly put kids in one group where they're going to take a test sitting down in the usual school way versus take a test standing up and moving around, or solve a puzzle standing up, and the kids who are standing up and moving around solve the puzzle better. Because we were built to think while we're moving, right? You never did hunting and gathering sitting in a seat. So we think while we're moving. And often even, writers and stuff will go on a walk and they'll be talking with their hands and doing what I'm doing. And then they go back to home and then they sit down and write what they just figured out while they were doing the walk. So that the heavy thinking was actually done by doing the walk. So again, thinking while moving. Okay, so this is just a reflection on the presence of anxiety and depression in modern childhood. We've actually built a world where children no longer are rarely engaged in mixed-age playgroups. They don't get to observe how older children and adults behave and build social bonds. They don't learn valued tasks often where they contribute to the household in a way that is valued. The thing has to be something that an adult would need to do if the kid didn't do it. And they want to do harder and harder things and take risks. At least where I'm from, we've removed almost all risk-taking in childhood. One of the reasons why I think that teens have so much social anxiety is they never trained up on how to be social. So building social bonds, connecting with others is actually a skill. And you cultivate that during your middle childhood when you're beginning interacting with older kids. In this lecture, I've discussed how both creativity and flourishing are nurtured by social connection and community. So the idea of the collective brain is this fractal idea where not only do you want connection among diverse minds at the level of the team, but it actually extends all the way out as far as you can reach. And each of these affects the likelihood of any one individual having an idea. Flourishing in the sense of the kind of life you want to lead, it really is about community, the social bonds, and the interconnected network. It's not just about having friends, it seems to be about having friends and relatives who are also friends and relatives. So it's the interconnectedness of the network, just not having friends. So rich interconnected networks of bonds, things like food sharing are important, of course laughter and touch seems to be important across societies. And crucially, finally, this begins in childhood with actually learning to build bonds and making contributions and caring for others. So being a valued member, being seen as a valued member of the network, and part of that's caring for others. All right? Okay, thanks for listening.